Hello and welcome to the Visual Storytelling Podcast. My name is Fred Ranger, and I thank you so much for joining me today for this very quick episode on what makes a great image. Of course, this is a very subjective question, but it's also something that I'm passionate about because every time I post a photo, every time I make a photograph, in the back of my mind, I'm trying to understand what makes people tick, what makes people like an image. And I came with a kind of a formula that I applied to my own photography. And this formula goes like this. So there's one thing that I'm pretty sure makes a good photograph, and this is the mastering of light. Light is the only source of truth when it comes to photography. I mean, if there's no light, there's no photograph. Of course, there's low light photography, and there is some very amazing photographer that are able to produce very, very unique images without a lot of light. And of course, there's artificial light. You can always get around with a flash or with a different source of light than the actual sun itself. But I think we can agree that at the end of the day, photography is about mastering light. And it doesn't have to be a perfect light. It doesn't have to be a sunset or a golden hour or a blue hour to make a good image or an image that, talks to people. Sometimes it can be a very harsh light, but if it helps convey your story, if it helps convey your message, this becomes an interesting use of the light. I've seen some, street photography with very harsh light on somebody's face to, put emphasis on that part of the story versus the buildings in the background. I've seen photographs that are taken at noon, and it's the middle of the day and the light is not so good, but the image is so powerful because there's two people interacting or looking at each other very intensively, and so on and so forth. So for me, light is the first ingredient of what makes a very good image. But light in itself is not enough. The composition of a photograph is very, very important too. What you decide to put in the frame, or actually, even more important, what you decide to exclude from the frame. What are you not putting in that little rectangle box or that square box, depending on how you like to shoot? You're making choices every time you press that shutter. Are you going to include that portion of the tree or the building or that person that's, on the edge of the frame? Are you going to put half of that object in the frame, or are you going to put it right in the middle? Of course, there's the rule of thumb, and that rule is meant to be broken. That's, not necessarily what makes a good photograph, in my opinion. The rule of thumb actually helps you position things in your frame so people can actually understand the story you're trying to tell. But if you're trying to tell a story that's not standard or that's not necessarily according to everybody's eyes pleasing, then you might break that rule of thumb. So for me, composition, what you decide to include in a frame, and more importantly, what you decide to exclude from the frame, becomes very, very important in telling your story in an image. And the third one is, I would call it my secret sauce. I would call it my special ingredient, or spice if you want. And I call it soul. And for me, soul is very, very important. It's hard to describe. Soul is not a color. Soul is not an object in a frame. Soul is literally intangible. You can't really touch it. You can't really see it, but you can actually feel it. And that is what I think is the most important thing in photography. Photography should make you feel something. Of course, there's the landscape photography that you see on Instagram or the influencer selfies, and they're all perfectly balanced, and the light was so great, and there was a sunset in the background. That's the photography that I don't care about. And I'm guilty of posting some of these, beautiful landscapes on my Instagram feed, and it's getting a lot of likes, but that's not the photography that moves me. That's not the photography that gets me up in the morning. That's not the photography that wants me to, me to pick up my camera in the morning and go shoot. The photography that gets me excited is the photography that makes me feel something. And there's no one formula that will make people feel something. So it's not like if I can tell you, if you put an image of someone touching someone else's hand and somebody in the background that's blurry and so on and so forth. So for me, it's a mix of art and science. So when the light is right, when the composition is helping convey the message, and with the right amount of soul, I think this is where you start to create very, very moving and storytelling photography. Of course, that's the type of images we're all striving for. And it doesn't happen often. If I look at my Lightroom catalog, I have hundreds of thousands of images in there. And I will say that there might be approximately 50 photos on hundreds of thousands of photos that really hit the nail on the 3 aspects that I just discussed. There's some very good images in there that are using perfect lighting, and the composition is so great, but it's still missing that soul element. I know when I see a photography that has soul, when I'm getting sucked into the photo, I open that magazine or I go on my feed, and I can spend literally minutes to an hour looking at an image because, wow, I'm now in my head, and I'm now trying to tell the story that the photographer was trying to tell me, and I'm pretty sure it's different, but it's making me feel something. And I even sometimes look at an image and start crying because it's so moving, it's so touching, or it's so beautiful, or it's so ugly, and ugly in a good way, so dark, So for me, those 3 elements are so important in this day and age, a day and age where people are sharing everything every day, and it's not necessarily fulfilling like a very, very good image. So that being said, should we only post photos that are perfectly aligned with those 3 elements, with composition, light, and soul? No, of course not. This is not in a book, Fahrenheit 451, or this is not George Orwell's 1984 book. You're allowed to post whatever you want. And I encourage you to post more photos because you'll get feedback, and you'll see, some of the photos that you might not even know that contains all these very interesting elements. You'll get instant feedback, and that for me is a way to get better as a photographer. But I want to know, what about you? What do you think makes a great image? This is my take on it, but I'm pretty sure that you have a different view on that. And maybe soul is not that important for you. Maybe for you, it's all about the composition, that what makes you tick, and that what makes you very excited about photography. Is it the way the photographer described the photo? Is it the caption under the photo? Because that's another element that we haven't talked about, but I think is really important. If you want people to tell their own stories, then say a little bit less. If you want to direct people towards feeling a certain way, maybe you want to put a little bit more context around the photo. So I think this is such a great day and age because we can communicate a lot of our stories through photography, through filmmaking, through podcasting like I'm doing today. and we can connect with so many people and get inspired by so many people and also get feedback on our work. I want to hear what you think about this subject, what makes a great image. If you want to reach out to me, you can do so through Twitter at Fred Ranger, also through the Grams on Instagram at Fred Ranger also, and I'm always available through this podcast. If you want to send me an email, it's visualstorytellingpodcast@gmail.com. And please don't hesitate to subscribe and review this podcast. I've been Fred Ranger. Please go out and shoot, get inspired, and we'll talk soon. Cheers.